What do you think is the most important attribute of God? I actually had a topic on this a little while back, and I said that I think the most important attribute of God is the one we're going to cover right now, which is divine simplicity. Now, we're going through the concept of God by Ronald Nash, and we're on chapter 7 on divine simplicity. We're getting close to the end, actually. There's only 10 chapters left, so we're on the back end of the book. Couple of problems, I think, with the way Nash characterizes divine simplicity, and that's at the very beginning in the intro and the very end in the conclusion. And in the intro, he says, the doctrine of divine simplicity has a public relations problem. I think that's true. Few people have even heard that God supposedly has the property of simplicity. True and false. One, I do think he's right in saying that most Christians are not aware or have never even heard of divine simplicity, even though I think it's the most important attribute of God and has been held in pretty much uniform, universal acceptance since the time, at least of Irenaeus, right after the closing of the New Testament. So, not long after that. So there's been a almost universal. I can't think of anybody who has explicitly rejected that in the ancient or medieval times. It's been pretty well accepted up until just a few decades ago. And even today, many theologians still hold to it. But if you were to ask your Christian friends, maybe you have never heard of it, ask your friends if they've ever heard of it, maybe your Sunday school teacher or your pastor, I would venture to say that most have not even heard of it. And that's not unusual. It's unfortunate, but it's not unusual. In fact, I have friends who have gone through seminary who have never even heard of the doctrine of divine simplicity. So I want to at least let you know what that is and argue for why I think it is true and address some of the objections that thinkers like Ronald Nash want to level against it. So I do think it's true to say that few people have heard of the doctrine, but the last half of the sentence I think is false. He says that God has the property of simplicity. Next sentence says, fewer still have any idea what the doctrine entails. Again, I think that's true, or why theologians have thought it necessary to ascribe the property to God. Why do I think that's wrong? Because of what I think divine simplicity is. Divine simplicity, if you remember from a few talks ago I gave on what I thought was the most important attribute of God, divine simplicity is the rejection of any kind of parts or distinctions or properties that God has. So if God is simple, he doesn't have any properties. These attributes we talk about that God has are not properties. We can talk about them in terms of the way Aquinas did as being names or characteristics or attributes, but not properties. Properties are something that have always been thought to adhere in something, whereas an attribute or a characteristic or just a name that we use to describe something is just that. It's a description of something, not a predication of something. In terms of many philosophers would say, for example, that I have the property of being white. I have the property of having blonde hair. I have the property of being 5'10". I have the property of having green eyes and all that kind of stuff. We can talk about that. Okay, those can be considered properties if you want. Or those can be accidents in the Aristotelian terminology, an accident being the way you're modified or having a predicament that he called them in his famous 10 categories. But those are all denied of God if simplicity is true. So we can talk about God being eternal. You can talk about God having knowledge, being loving. You can talk about God being omnipresent. You name it. But if divine simplicity is true, those things are not and cannot be properties in the normal sense of what a property is, because a property normally is something that modifies the existence of something else. So, for example, my skin color can be modified depending on if I go out in the sun or not, whether it can become red or darker or whatever. So those are modifications of my being, right? So I could have surgery and maybe not need glasses anymore. And that would be a modification of my being. I can get my hair cut, and it might not look like it, but I need a haircut. That'd be a modification of my being. If simplicity is true, God isn't modified, because that would mean that something else modified God, and that God has the passive potentiality to be modified. Well, simplicity really flows out of the idea that God is pure, unlimited, infinite being, that God does not have parts or any kind of division in his existence. So if the idea of God being pure act, something else I also mentioned, I can have these descriptions in the links in the description. If God's pure act, he doesn't have any kind of passive potentiality. And if he did, he would have different parts. And if he had those different parts, his parts would have to be somehow be held together and depend on each other. And for God, there is no dependence on anything for his own existing. Now, there are a lot of questions that will come up with this. Please leave your questions in the comments. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment. Ask a question. I'd love to answer that for you best I can. Now, so simplicity again is just, and I'll leave a link to the previous video I did, or talk on this that I did on simplicity a while back, so you can have a more in-depth discussion. But simplicity is just the denial that God has any kind of modifications to his being, or any kind of division or different kind of parts. Like you and I have a soul and a body. We have a substance, our humanness, and accidents, like your different properties of being white, black, male, female, whatever. God is said not to have anything like that. We are said to have our essence and existence. Like we have the essence of being human, and we actually exist, because it's not part of the essence to be human, or we would exist necessarily because of what we are. Only God exists on his own because of what he is. So simplicity is a denial of all these different kinds of ways that God can be put together. Okay. So I think it's wrong the way that Nash characterizes this, in terms of people believing in simplicity, because it again solves a problem about extreme or hyper-realism versus nominalism. There may be thinkers who held to divine simplicity for this reason, because it rejected these different other problems, and it was a way at coming to a conclusion that avoided problems. But again, I think that methodology is wrong. That we shouldn't just try to describe what God is based on the answers that we get from looking at different problems that arise. Rather, we should deduce what we think is God's being by looking at the effects he's made, and saying, based on the effects, God can't have the same characteristics as the effects, or God would also be an effect. There's got to be a cause to all contingent being. So God couldn't be contingent being. So then what would non-contingent or necessary being look like? So that's what simplicity is in a nutshell. I'm not going to cover every little aspect in here that he talks about. I do want to talk about these two objections that he gives, starting on page 91, a contemporary analysis of simplicity. Now, I was fortunate enough to, back in 2018, be on a panel on the question of whether or not God is simple. It was with me and Richard Howe, Stephen Davis, and William Lane Craig. Richard Howe and I argued in favor of simplicity, and Davis and Craig argued against it. But he brings up, that as Nash brings up, two objections to divine simplicity that Alvin Plantinga brought up in his 1980 book, or lecture that became a book, Does God Have a Nature? And this book that we're looking at came out in 1983, so it was pretty recent to Plantinga's book. One objection is what I call the property synonymity problem, is that, well, if simplicity is true, Plantinga says, and Plantinga, if you know who he is, Alvin Plantinga is one of the most well-known Christian philosophers of the 20th century. Very brilliant person, very analytic in his methodology, reformed, good thinker. I don't agree with everything he says, but he is a very good thinker. But he says if God is simple, then he's identical to all of his properties. Now, again, I don't think God has properties, but he says properties. If God is identical to all of his properties, then all of his properties are identical to each other. So if God is equivalent to A, and if God is equivalent to B, then A is equivalent to B. That would mean that if A stands for knowledge and B stands for power, then knowledge and power mean the same thing. And Plantinga and others like Bill Craig say, well, if that can't be true because that's just ridiculous. Because we know from experience and just by definition that power and knowledge are not the same things. Therefore, divine simplicity can't be true. So how would somebody who upholds divine simplicity say to an objection like that? Well, interestingly, Aquinas has a response back in the 1200s on this very objection, and it's in question 13 of the first part of his Summa Theologiae. I will leave a link to that in the description. But in Article 4, in Part 1, question 13 on divine names, Article 4, Aquinas talks about whether or not the names, what we call characteristics, attributes, what Plantinga calls properties, if those are synonymous. And ultimately, they are synonymous in God, but not to us. And a lot of this discussion gets collapsed because we don't make a distinction between the way something is known by us and the way something exists in and of itself. So, for example, we know what knowledge and power and love and mercy and all that are because of our experience of the physical material world that we live in. So we know things through composition. All things around us have parts, different kinds of parts. So we only know about God, I would argue at least mainly, through his physical creation. So Romans 1 says that we know about the divine nature and eternal power because of what has been made, what's been clearly seen. So we can reason back to what God is through his physical material creation or his effects. So we know about the ultimate cause by looking at and through his effects, but his effects are all composed and put together by certain kind of parts. So we can say we know the simple God through his composed creation. We don't know God directly. I know there are some people who say that we have an innate sense of God. We know God directly in some ways. That's not what I'm maintaining that here. I'm not maintaining. I'm maintaining that we know God through his created order, and because we do, we arrive at a knowledge of a simple substance that is God through the composed effects that God has made. And to us, those effects are composite. They're put together. They're complex. But in God, because God doesn't have knowledge according to simplicity. God doesn't have goodness according to simplicity. God is knowledge. God is goodness. God is power. Nash brings it up in his discussion here. So knowledge, power, and goodness are all different ways of describing the infinite being of the necessary existence of God, the divine creator. So it's not like God has some property, whatever that would mean for God, of goodness or knowledge. It's all different ways of describing the divine essence. But the divine essence is infinite. There's no distinctions in the divine essence. So that's what simplicity is, and that's why we can say that the properties are and are not synonymous. They're not synonymous in God, because in God, everything is identical to as one infinite substance. But to us, we know things through a composed understanding. So the way we know things is not exactly the way that things always are in reality. We know through composition, and we can arrive at a God who is simple. So we, for example, would know directly material physical things, and then can reason back to God being immaterial. So we can see that we can arrive at a knowledge of the cause through material things, and the cause not being material. So there's an analogy there. The other objection that Plantinga brings up, that Nash brings up as well, is the idea that if God is identical to a property, and God has all that he is and is all that he has, and if God has a property, then what? Then he is a property. So to say God is identical to its properties is just to say that God is a property, which seems ridiculous, and it is. But again, we don't fall under that objection because we don't maintain, contra Plantinga and Nash, that God has properties. So since God doesn't have properties, he isn't one. That kind of objection doesn't work with with words like attributes or names or characteristics, because those are just ways of describing God, not something that God possesses or has in some way. There's not some property that God is modified by or changed by. This is a very, very important doctrine. I would encourage you to read about it. One book that's really good to introduce it to people would be God Without Parts by James Dolezal. So I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. Part 1, question 3 in the Summa Theologiae is a good place. And then part 1 of the Summa Contra Gentiles is also a good place to go. And I'll leave links there as well in the description. So I hope this was encouraging, at least thought-provoking for you. Please ask a question if you want to. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.